Gems of Buddhist Wisdom. Theravada, Mahayana Buddhism. Venerable Drive W. Rahula. From, Gems of Buddhist Wisdom. Buddhist Missionary Society, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, 1996. Let us discuss a question often asked by many people: what is the difference between Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism? To see things in their proper perspective, let us turn to the history of Buddhism and trace the emergence and development of Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism. The Buddha was born in the 6th century BC. After attaining enlightenment at the age of 35 until his Mahaparinibbana at the age of 80, he spent his life preaching and teaching. He was certainly one of the most energetic men who ever lived. For 45 years he taught and preached day and night, sleeping for only about 2 hours a day. The Buddha spoke to all kinds of people: kings and princes, Brahmins, farmers, beggars, learned men, and ordinary people. His teachings were tailored to the experiences, levels of understanding and mental capacity of his audience. What he taught was called Buddha Vacana, i.e. word of the Buddha. There was nothing called Theravada or Mahayana at that time. After establishing the order of monks and nuns, the Buddha laid down certain disciplinary rules called the Vinaya for the guidance of the order. The rest of his teachings were called the Dhamma, which included his discourses, sermons to monks, nuns, and lay people. The First Council. 3 months after the Buddha's Mahaparinibbana, his immediate disciples convened a council at Rajagaha. Mahakassapa, the most respected and elderly monk, presided at the council. 2 very important personalities who specialized in the 2 different areas, the Dhamma and the Vinaya, were present. One was Ananda, the closest constant companion and disciple of the Buddha for 25 years. Endowed with a remarkable memory, Ananda was able to recite what was spoken by the Buddha. The other personality was Upali, who remembered all the Vinaya rules. Only these 2 sections, the Dhamma and the Vinaya, were recited at the first council. Though there were no differences of opinion on the Dhamma, no mention of the Abhidhamma, there was some discussion about the Vinaya rules. Before the Buddha's Parinibbana, he had told Ananda that if the Sangha wished to amend or modify some minor rules, they could do so. But on that occasion Ananda was so overpowered with grief because the Buddha was about to die that it did not occur to him to ask the master what the minor rules were. As the members of the council were unable to agree as to what constituted the minor rules, Mahakassapa finally ruled that no disciplinary rule laid down by the Buddha should be changed, and no new ones should be introduced. No intrinsic reason was given. Mahakassapa did say one thing, however. If we changed the rules, people will say that Venerable Gautama's disciples changed the rules even before his funeral fire has ceased burning. At the council, the Dhamma was divided into various parts and each part was assigned to an elder and his pupils to commit to memory. The Dhamma was then passed on from teacher to pupil orally. The Dhamma was recited daily by groups of people who often cross-check with each other to ensure that no omissions or additions were made. Historians agree that the oral tradition is more reliable than a report written by one person from his memory several years after the event. The Second Council. 100 years later, the Second Council was held to discuss some Vinaya rules. There was no need to change the rules 3 months after the Parinibbana of the Buddha because little or no political, economic, or social changes took place during that short interval. But 100 years later, some monks saw the need to change certain minor rules. The orthodox monks said that nothing should be changed while the others insisted on modifying some rules. Finally, a group of monks left the council and formed the Mahasanghika, the great community. Even though it was called the Mahasanghika, it was not known as Mahayana. And in the Second Council, only matters pertaining to the Vinaya were discussed and no controversy about the Dhamma is reported. The Third Council. In the 3rd century BC, during the time of Emperor Asoka, the Third Council was held to discuss the differences of opinion among the bhikkhus of different sects. At this council the differences were not confined to the Vinaya but were also connected with the Dhamma. At the end of this council, the president of the council, Moggaliputta Tissa, compiled a book called the Kathavatha refuting the heretical, false views and theories held by some sects. The teaching approved and accepted by this council was known as Theravada. The Abhidhamma Pitaka was included at this council. After the third council, Asoka's son, Venerable Mahinda, brought the Tripitaka to Sri Lanka, along with the commentaries that were recited at the third council. The texts brought to Sri Lanka were preserved until today without losing a page. The texts were written in Pali, which was based on the Magadhi language spoken by the Buddha. There was nothing known as Mahayana at that time. Coming of Mahayana. Between the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD, the two terms Mahayana and Hinayana appeared in the Sadharma Pundarika Sutra, or the Sutra of the Lotus of the Good Law. About the 2nd century AD, Mahayana became clearly defined. Nagarjuna developed the Mahayana philosophy of Sunyata and proved that everything is void in a small text called Madhyamika Karika. About the 4th century, there were Asanga and Vasubandhu who wrote enormous amount of works on Mahayana. After the 1st century AD, the Mahayanists took a definite stand, and only then the terms of Mahayana and Hinayana were introduced. We must not confuse Hinayana with Theravada because the terms are not synonymous. Theravada Buddhism went to Sri Lanka during the 3rd century BC when there was no Mahayana at all. Hinayana sects developed in India and had an existence independent from the form of Buddhism existing in Sri Lanka. Today there is no Hinayana sect in existence anywhere in the world. Therefore, in 1950 the World Fellowship of Buddhists inaugurated in Colombo unanimously decided that the term Hinayana should be dropped when referring to Buddhism existing today in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, Cambodia, Laos, etc. This is the brief history of Theravada, Mahayana, and Hinayana. Mahayana and Theravada. Now, what is the difference between Mahayana and Theravada? I have studied Mahayana for many years, and the more I study it, the more I find there is hardly any difference between Theravada and Mahayana with regard to the fundamental teachings. Both accept Sakyamuni Buddha as the teacher. The Four Noble Truths are exactly the same in both schools. The Eightfold Path is exactly the same in both schools. The Paticca Samuppada, or the dependent origination, is the same in both schools. Both rejected the idea of a supreme being who created and governed this world. Both accept anicca, dukkha, anatta, and sila, samadhi, panna without any difference. These are the most important teachings of the Buddha, and they are all accepted by both schools without question. There are also some points where they differ. An obvious one is the Bodhisattva ideal. Many people say that Mahayana is for the Bodhisattvahood which leads to Buddhahood, while Theravada is for Arahantship. I must point out that the Buddha was also an Arahant. Pacceka Buddha is also an Arahant. A disciple can also be an Arahant. The Mahayana texts never use the term Arahantyana, Arahant vehicle. They used three terms, Bodhisattvayana, Praitkabuddhayana, and Sravakayana. In the Theravada tradition these three are called bodhis. Some people imagine that Theravada is selfish because it teaches that people should seek their own salvation. But how can a selfish person gain enlightenment? Both schools accept the three yanas or bodhis but consider the bodhisattva ideal as the highest. The Mahayana has created many mystical bodhisattvas, while the Theravada considers a bodhisattva as a man amongst us who devotes his entire life for the attainment of perfection, ultimately becoming a fully enlightened Buddha for the welfare of the world, for the happiness of the world. Three types of Buddhahood. There are three types of Buddhahood: the Sammasambuddha who gains full enlightenment by his own effort, the Pacceka Buddha who has lesser qualities than the Sammasambuddha, and the Savaka Buddha who is an Arahant disciple. The attainment of Nibbana between the three types of Buddhahood is exactly the same. The only difference is that the Sammasambuddha has many more qualities and capacities than the other two. Some people think that voidness or sunyata discussed by Nagarjuna is purely a Mahayana teaching. It is based on the idea of anatta or non-self, on the Paticca Samuppada or the dependent origination, found in the original Theravada Pali texts. Once Ananda asked the Buddha, "People say the word sunyat. What is sunyat?" The Buddha replied, "Ananda, there is no self, nor anything pertaining to self in this world. Therefore, the world is empty. This idea was taken by Nagarjuna when he wrote his remarkable book, Madhyamika Karika. Besides the idea of sunyata is the concept of the store consciousness in Mahayana Buddhism, which has its seed in the Theravada texts. The Mahayanists have developed it into a deep psychology and philosophy. Venerable Drive W. Rahula. Gems of Buddhist Wisdom. Bodhisattva Ideal in Buddhism, 27. Venerable Drive W. Rahula. From Gems of Buddhist Wisdom. Buddhist Missionary Society, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, 1996. There is a widespread belief, particularly in the West, that the ideal of the Theravada, which they conveniently identify with Hinayana, is to become an arahant, while that of the Mahayana is to become a bodhisattva and finally to attain the state of a Buddha. It must be categorically stated that this is incorrect. This idea was spread by some early Orientalists at a time when Buddhist studies were beginning in the West. And the others who followed them accepted it without taking the trouble to go into the problem by examining the texts and living traditions in Buddhist countries. But the fact is that both the Theravada and the Mahayana unanimously accept the Bodhisattva ideal as the highest. The terms Hinayana, small vehicle, and Mahayana, great vehicle, are not known to the Theravada Pali literature. They are not found in the Pali Canon, Tripitaka, or in the commentaries on the Tripitaka. Not even in the Pali Chronicles of Ceylon, the Dipavamsa and the Mahavamsa. The Dipavamsa, about the 4th century AD, and Pali commentaries mention Vaitandavadins. Evidently a sect of dissenting Buddhists holding some unorthodox views regarding some points in the teaching of the Buddha. The Vaitandavadan and the Theravada both quote the same authorities and name the sutras of the Tripitaka in order to support their positions. The difference being only in the mode of their interpretations. The Mahavamsa, 5th century AD, and a commentary on the Abhidhamma refer to Vetala, or Vachalyavadins, Sanskrit, Vachalyavadan, instead of Vaitandavadan. From the evidence of the texts, it may not be wrong to consider that these two terms, Vaitanda and Vechalya, represented the same school or sect. We learn from the Abhidhamma Samakya, an authoritative Mahayana philosophical text, 4th century AD, that the terms Vachalya and Vaipilya are synonymous. And that Vaipilya is the Bodhisattva Pitaka. Now, the Bodhisattva Pitaka is definitely Mahayana. Hence Vachalya undoubtedly denotes Mahayana. So we can be certain that the terms Vaitanda and Vechalya used in the Pali Chronicles and commentaries refer to Mahayana. But the terms Hinayana and Mahayana were not known to them, or ignored or unrecognized by them. It is universally accepted by scholars that the terms Hinayana and Mahayana are later inventions. Historically speaking, the Theravada already existed long before these terms came into being. That Theravada, considered to be the original teaching of the Buddha, was introduced to Ceylon and established there in the 3rd century BC. During the time of Emperor Asoka of India. At that time there was nothing called Mahayana. Mahayana as such appeared much later, about the beginning of the Christian era. Without Mahayana there could not be Hinayana. Buddhism that went to Sri Lanka, with its Tripitaka and commentaries, in the 3rd century BC. Remained there intact as Theravada, and did not come into the scene of the Hinayana-Mahayana dispute that developed later in India. It seems therefore not legitimate to include Theravada in either of these two categories. The Mahayana mainly deals with the Bodhisattvayana or the vehicle of the Bodhisattva. But it does not ignore the other two, Sravakayana and Pratyekabuddhayana. For example, Asanga. The founder of the Yogacara system, in his magnum opus, the Yogacara Bhumisastra, devotes 2 sections to Sravakabhumi and Pratyekabuddhabhumi to Bodhisattvabhumi. Which shows that all 3 yanas are given due consideration in the Mahayana. But the state of a Sravaka or a Pratyekabuddha is inferior to that of a Bodhisattva. This is quite in keeping with the Theravada tradition which, too, holds that one may become a Bodhisattva and attain the state of a fully enlightened Buddha. But if one cannot, one may attain the state of a Pratyeka Buddha or of a Sravaka according to one's capacity. These three states may be considered as three attainments on the same path. In fact, the Sandhi Nirmakana Sutra, a Mahayana sutra, clearly says that the Sravakayana and the Mahayana constitute one yana, Ekayana, and that they are not two different and distinct vehicles. The three individuals. Now, who are these three individuals, Sravaka, Pratyeka Buddha, and Bodhisattva? Very briefly. A Sravaka is a disciple of a Buddha. A disciple may be a monk or a nun, a layman, or a laywoman. Bent on his or her liberation, a Sravaka follows and practices the reaching of the Buddha and finally attains nirvana. He also serves others, but his capacity to do so is limited. A Pratyeka Buddha, individual Buddha, is a person who realizes nirvana alone by himself at a time when there is no Samyak Sambuddha in the world. He also renders service to others, but in a limited way. He is not capable of revealing the truth to others as a Samyak Sambuddha, a fully enlightened Buddha does. A Bodhisattva is a person, monk or layman, who is in a position to attain nirvana as a Sravaka or as a Pratyeka Buddha. But out of great compassion, Mahakaruna, for the world, he renounces it and goes on suffering in samsara for the sake of others. Perfects himself during an incalculable period of time and finally realizes nirvana and becomes a Samyak Sambuddha. A fully enlightened Buddha. He discovers the truth and declares it to the world. His capacity for service to others is unlimited. The definition of the three Yanikas, followers of the three Yanas, given by Asanga is very instructive and clarifies some points. According to him, a Sravakayanika, one who takes the vehicle of disciples, is a person who, living according to the law of the disciples, by nature having feeble faculties, qualities, bent on his own liberation through the cultivation of detachment. Depending on the canon of the disciples, Sravaka Pitaka, practicing major and minor qualities, gradually puts an end to suffering. A Pratyeka Buddhayanika, one who takes the vehicle of the individual Buddha, is a person who, lives according to the law of the individual Buddha. By nature having medium faculties, bent on his liberation through the cultivation of detachment. He has the intention of attaining enlightenment exclusively through his own mental development. Depending on the Sravaka Pitaka, practicing major and minor qualities, born at a time when there is no Buddha in the world and gradually puts an end to suffering. A Mahayanika, one who takes the great vehicle, is a person who, living according to the law of the Bodhisattvas, by nature having sharp faculties, bent on the liberation of all beings, depending on the canon of the Bodhisattvas, matures other beings, cultivates the pure Buddha domain, receives predictions or declarations, Vyakarana, from Buddhas and finally realizes the perfect and complete enlightenment, Samyaksambhati. From this we can see that anyone who aspires to become a Buddha is a Bodhisattva, a Mahayanist. Though he may live in a country or in a community popularly and traditionally regarded as Theravada or Hinayana. Similarly, a person who aspires to attain nirvana as a disciple is a Sravakayanika or Hinayanist though he may belong to a country or a community considered as Mahayana. Thus it is wrong to believe that there are no bodhisattvas in Theravada countries or that all are bodhisattvas in Mahayana countries. It is not conceivable that Sravakas and bodhisattvas are concentrated in separate geographical areas. Further, Asanga says that when a bodhisattva finally attains enlightenment, Bodhi, he becomes an arahant, a Tathagata, i.e. Buddha. Here it must be clearly understood that not only a Sravaka, disciple, but also a bodhisattva becomes an arahant when finally he attains Buddhahood. The Theravada position is exactly the same. The Buddha is an arahant araham sama sambuddha, arahant, fully and perfectly enlightened Buddha. The Mahayana unequivocally says that a Buddha, a Pratyeka Buddha, and a Sravaka, disciple. All three are equal and alike with regard to their purification or liberation from defilements or impurities, Klesavaranavasuddhi. This is also called Vimutikaya, liberation body, and in it there is no difference between the three. That means that there are no three different nirvanas or vimutas for three persons. Nirvana or Vimudi is the same for all. But only a Buddha achieves the complete liberation from all the obstructions to the knowable, i.e., obstructions to knowledge, Jnana Yavaranavasuddhi, not the Sravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas. This also is called Dharmakaya, Dharmabodhi. And it is in this and many other innumerable qualities, capacities, and abilities that the Buddha becomes incomparable and superior to Sravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas. This Mahayana view is quite in keeping with the Theravada Pali Tripitaka. In the Samyutta Nikaya the Buddha says that the Tathagata, i.e. Buddha, and a bhikkhu, i.e. Sravaka, disciple, liberated through wisdom are equal with regard to their vimudda, liberation. But the Tathagata is different and distinguished from the liberated bhikkhus in that he, Tathagata, discovers and shows the path, magga, that was not known before. These three states of the Sravaka, the Pratyeka Buddha, and the Buddha are mentioned in the Nidhikanda Sutta of the Kadakapatha. The first book of the Kadaka Nikaya, one of the 5 collections of the Theravada Tripitaka. It says that by practicing virtues such as charity, morality, self-restraint, etc., one may attain, among other things, the perfection of the disciple, Savakaparamai. Enlightenment of the Pratyeka Buddha, Pakskabhati, and the Buddha domain, Buddhabhumi. They are not called yanas, vehicles. In the Theravada tradition these are known as bodhis, but not yanas. The Upasaka Janalankara, a Pali treatise dealing with the ethics for the lay Buddhist written in the 12th century by a Thera called Ananda. In the Theravada tradition of the Mahavihara at Anuradhapura, Sri Lanka, says that there are 3 bodhis. Savakabhati, SKT, Sravakabhati, Pakskabhati, SKT, Pratyekabhati, and Samasambhati, SKT, Samyaksambhati. A whole chapter of this book is devoted to the discussion of these 3 bodhis in great detail. It says further that when a disciple attains the bodhi, enlightenment, he is called Savakabuddha, SKT, Sravakabuddha. The Bodhisattvas. Just like the Mahayana, the Theravada holds the Bodhisattva in the highest position. The commentary on the Jataka, in the tradition of the Mahavihara at Anuradhapura, provides a precise example. In the dim past, many incalculable eons ago, Gautama the Buddha, during his career as Bodhisattva, was an ascetic named Sumedha. At that time there was a Buddha called Dipankara whom he met and at whose feet he had the capacity to realize nirvana as a disciple, Sravaka. But Sumedha renounced it and resolved, out of great compassion for the world, to become a Buddha like Dipankara to save others. Then Dipankara Buddha declared and predicted that this great ascetic would one day become a Buddha and offered 8 handfuls of flowers to Sumedha. Likewise, Dipankara Buddha's disciples who were with him and who were themselves Aryans offered flowers to the Bodhisattva. This story of Sumedha distinctly shows the position a Bodhisattva occupies in the Theravada. Although the Theravada holds that anybody can be a Bodhisattva, it does not stipulate or insist that all must be Bodhisattva, which is considered not practical. The decision is left to the individual whether to take the path of the Sravaka or of the Pratyeka Buddha or of the Samyaksambhuddha. But it is always clearly explained that the state of a Samyaksambhuddha is superior and that the other 2 are inferior. Yet they are not disregarded. In the 12th century AD, in Myanmar, a strictly Theravada country, King Alasathu, a pagan, after building Shwegyagi temple, set up an inscription in Pali verse to record this act of piety in which he publicly declared his resolution to become a Buddha and not a Sravaka. In Sri Lanka, in the 10th century, King Mahinda IV, 956–972 AD, in an inscription proclaimed that none but the Bodhisattvas would become kings of Sri Lanka, Ceylon. Thus it was believed that kings of Sri Lanka were Bodhisattvas. A Thera named Mahatipitaka Kilabhaya who wrote the Milandatika, about the 12th century AD. In the Theravada tradition of the Mahavihara at Anuradhapura, says at the end of the book in the Colophon that he aspires to become a Buddha. Buddho Bhavayam, may I become a Buddha, which means that this author is a Bodhisattva. We come across at the end of some palm leaf manuscripts of Buddhist texts in Sri Lanka the names of even a few copyists who have recorded their wish to become Buddhas. And they too are to be considered as bodhisattvas. At the end of a religious ceremony or an act of piety, the bhikkhu who gives benedictions usually admonishes the congregation to make a resolution to attain nirvana by realizing one of the three bodhis, sravakabodhi, pratyekabodhi, or samyaksambodhi, as they wish according to their capacity. There are many Buddhists, both bhikkhus and laymen, in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, and Cambodia which are regarded as Theravada countries, who take the vow or resolution to become Buddhas to save others. They are indeed bodhisattvas at different levels of development. Thus one may see that in Theravada countries all are not Sravakas. There are bodhisattvas as well. There is a significant difference between the Theravada and the Mahayana with regard to the bodhisattva ideal. The Theravada, although it holds the bodhisattva ideal as the highest and the noblest, does not provide a separate literature devoted to the subject. The teachings about the bodhisattva ideal and the bodhisattva career are to be found scattered in their due places in Pali literature. The Mahayana by definition is dedicated to the bodhisattva ideal. And they have not only produced a remarkable literature on the subject but also created a fascinating class of mythical bodhisattvas. Venerable Drive W. Rahula. Gems of Buddhist Wisdom. Religion in a Scientific Age, 28. By Venerable Dr. K Sri Dhammananda. Today we live in a scientific age in which almost every aspect of our lives have been affected by science. Since the scientific revolution during the 17th century, science has continued to exert tremendous influence on what we think and do. The impact of science has been particularly strong on traditional religious beliefs. Many basic religious concepts are crumbling under the pressure of modern science and are no longer acceptable to the intellectual and the well-informed man. No longer is it possible to assert truth derived merely through theological speculations or based on the authority of religious scriptures in isolation to scientific considerations. For instance, the belief that the earth lies in the center of the universe once upheld as sacred in certain religions had been completely demolished with the advent of scientific thought. To cite another example, the findings of modern psychologists indicate that the human mind, like his physical body, works according to natural, causal laws without the presence of an unchanging soul taught by some religions. Some religionists choose to discard scientific discoveries which conflict with their religious dogmas. Such rigid mental habits are indeed a hindrance to human progress. Since the modern man refuses to believe anything blindly, even though it had been traditionally accepted, such religionists will only succeed in increasing the ranks of non-believers with their faulty theories. On the other hand, some religionists have found it necessary to accommodate popularly accepted scientific theories by giving new interpretations to their religious dogmas. A case in point in Darwin's theory of evolution. Many religionists maintain that man was directly created by God. Darwin, on the other hand, claimed that man had evolved from the ape. A theory which upset the doctrines of divine creation and the fall of man. Since all enlightened thinkers have accepted Darwin's theory, the theologians today have little choice except to give new interpretation to their doctrines to suit this theory which they had opposed for so long. In the light of modern scientific discoveries, it is not difficult to understand that many of the views held in many religions regarding the universe and life are merely conventional thoughts of intellectual climates that had long passed. It is generally true to say that religions have greatly contributed to human development and progress. They have laid down values and standards and formulated principles to guide human life. But for all the good they have done, religions can no longer survive in the modern, scientific age if the followers insist on imprisoning truth into set forms and dogmas, on encouraging ceremonies and practices which have been depleted of their original meaning. Buddhism and science. Buddhism originated 2,500 years ago in India. Until the beginning of the last century, it was confined to countries untouched by modern science. Nevertheless, from its very beginning, the teachings of the Buddha was always open to scientific thinking. One reason why the teaching can easily embrace the scientific spirit is that the Buddha never encouraged rigid, dogmatic belief. He did not claim to base his teachings on faith, belief, or divine revelation, but allowed great flexibility and freedom of thought. The second reason is that the scientific spirit can be found in the Buddha's approach to spiritual truth. The Buddha's method for discovering and testing spiritual truth is very similar to that of the scientist. A scientist observes the external world objectively, and would only establish a scientific theory after conducting many successful practical experiments. Using a similar approach 2,500 years ago, the Buddha observed the inner world with detachment, and encouraged his disciples not to accept any teaching until they had critically investigated and personally verified its truth. Just as the scientist today would not claim that his experiment cannot be duplicated by others, the Buddha did not claim that his experience of enlightenment was exclusive to him. Thus, in his approach to truth, the Buddha was as scientific as the present-day scientist. He had established a practical, scientifically worked-out method for reaching the ultimate truth and the experience of enlightenment. While Buddhism is very much in line with the scientific spirit, it is not correct to equate Buddhism with science. It is true that the practical applications of science have enabled mankind to live more comfortable lives and experience wonderful things undreamed of before. Science has made it possible for man to swim better than the fishes, fly higher than the birds, and walk on the moon. Yet the sphere of knowledge acceptable to conventional, scientific wisdom is confined to empirical evidence. And scientific truth is subject to constant change. Science cannot give man control over his mind, and neither does it offer moral control and guidance. Despite its wonders, science has indeed many limitations not shared by Buddhism. Limitations of science. Often one hears so much about science and what it can do, and so little about what it cannot do. Scientific knowledge is limited to the data received through the sense organs. It does not recognize reality which transcends sense data. Scientific truth is built upon logical observations of sense data which are continually changing. Scientific truth is, therefore, relative truth not intended to stand the test of time. And a scientist, being aware of this fact, is always willing to discard a theory if it can be replaced by a better one. Science attempts to understand the outer world and barely scratch the surface of man's inner world. Even the science of psychology has not really fathomed into the underlying cause of man's mental unrest. When a man is frustrated and disgusted with life, and his inner world is filled with disturbances and unrest, science today is very much unable to help him. The social sciences which cater for man's environment may bring him a certain degree of happiness. But unlike an animal, man requires more than mere physical comfort and needs help to cope with his frustrations and miseries arising from his daily experiences. Today so many people are plagued with fear, restlessness, and insecurity. Yet science fails to succor them. Science is unable to teach the common man to control his mind when he is driven by the animal nature that burns within him. Can science make man better? If so, why then do violent acts and immoral practices abound in countries which are so advanced in science? Isn't it fair to say that despite all the scientific progress achieved and the advantages conferred on man, science leaves the inner man basically unchanged? It has only heightened man's feelings of dependence and insufficiency. In addition to its failure to bring security to mankind, science has also made everyone feel even more insecure by threatening the world with the possibility of wholesale destruction. Science is unable to provide a meaningful plan and purpose of life. It cannot provide man a clear reason for his living. In fact, science is thoroughly secular in nature and unconcerned with man's spiritual goal. The materialism inherent in scientific thought denies the psyche goals higher than material satisfaction. By its selective theorizing and relative truths, science disregards some of the most essential issues and leaves many questions unanswered. For instance, when asked why great inequalities exist among mankind, no scientific explanation can be given to such questions which have gone beyond its narrow confines. Learned ignorance. The transcendental mind developed by the Buddha is not limited to sense data and goes beyond the logic trapped within the limitation of relative perception. The human intellect, on the contrary, operates on the basis of information it collects and stores, whether in the field of religion, philosophy, science, or art. The source of information for the mind are gathered through our sense organs, which are inferior in so many ways. The very limited information perceived makes our understanding of the word distorted. In his book, Learned Ignorance, a French scholar by the name of Nicholas of Cusa observed, "All our much vaunted knowledge based on our senses is really ignorance. And that true knowledge is only obtained by shedding all this until we think without using sense ideas. Truth does not depend on matters outside ourselves, but it is within us. We cannot hope to find truth by experiment and sense perception, or even by logic and reason. These are instruments to gain knowledge, but not the truth. Truth must come from inner realization. Books can only stimulate thought and give you knowledge. For truth you must turn your eyes inwards, for it is within you. Therefore, search for knowledge is one thing, and search for truth is another thing. Words are the products of our finite minds, and our minds depend for all their knowledge on the experience of our senses. These senses are sometimes not reliable. One incident that have been seen by many people may be explained in different ways. Some people are proud of the fact that they know so much. In fact, the less we know, the more certain we are in our explanations. The more we know, the more we realize our limitations. A brilliant scholar once wrote a book which he considered as the ultimate work. He felt that the book contained all the literary gems and philosophies. Being proud of his achievement, he showed his masterpiece to a colleague of his who was equally brilliant, with the request that the book be reviewed by him. Instead, his colleague asked the author to write down on a piece of paper all he knew and all he did not know. The author sat down deep in thoughts, but after a long while failed to write down everything he knew. Then he turned his mind to the second question, and again he failed to write down anything he did not know. Finally, with his ego at the lowest ebb, he gave up, realizing that all that he knew was really ignorance. In this regard, Socrates, the well-known Athenian philosopher of the ancient world, had this to say when asked what he knew. "I know only one thing, that I do not know." Beyond science. Buddhism goes beyond modern science in its acceptance of wider field of knowledge than is allowed by the scientific mind. Buddhism admits knowledge arising from the sense organs as well as personal experiences gained through mental culture. By training and developing a highly concentrated mind, religious experience can be understood and verified. Religious experience is not something which can be understood by conducting experiments in a test tube or examined under the microscope. The truth discovered by science is relative and subject to changes, while that found by the Buddha is final and absolute. The truth of Dhamma does not change according to time and space. Furthermore, in contrast to the selective theorizing of science, the Buddha encouraged the wise not to cling to theories, scientific or otherwise. Instead of theorizing, the Buddha taught mankind how to live a righteous life so as to discover ultimate truths. By living a righteous life, by calming down the senses, and by casting off desires, the Buddha pointed the way through which we can discover within ourselves the nature of life. And the real purpose of life can be found. Practice is important in Buddhism. A person who studies much but does not practice is like one who is able to recite recipes from a huge cookery book without trying to prepare a single dish. His hunger cannot be relieved by book knowledge alone. Practice is such an important prerequisite of enlightenment that in some schools of Buddhism, such as Zen, practice is put even ahead of knowledge. The scientific method is outwardly directed, and the modern scientists exploit nature and the elements for their own comfort, often disregarding the need to harmonize with the environment and causing pollution to the world. In contrast, Buddhism is inwardly directed and is concerned with the inner development of man. On the lower level, Buddhism teaches the individual how to adjust and cope with event and circumstances of daily life. At the higher level, it represents the human endeavor to grow beyond himself through the practice of mental culture or mind development taught by the Buddha. Buddhism has a complete system of mental culture concerned with gaining insight into the nature of things, which leads to complete self-realization of the ultimate truth, nibbana. This system is both practical and scientific. It involves dispassionate observation of emotional and mental states. More like a scientist than a judge, a meditator observes the inner world with mindfulness. Science without religion. Without having moral ideals, science poses a danger to all mankind. Science has made the machine, which in turn becomes king. The bullet and bomb are the gifts of science to the few in power, on whom the destiny of the world depends. Meanwhile, the rest of mankind waits in anguish and fear, not knowing when the nuclear weapons, the poisonous gases, the deadly arms, all fruits of scientific research designed to kill efficiently, will be used on them. Not only is science completely unable to provide moral guidance to mankind, it has also fed fuel to the flame of human craving. Science devoid of morality spells only destruction. It becomes the draconian monster man discovered. And unfortunately, this very monster is becoming more powerful than man himself. Unless man learns to restrain and govern the monster through the practice of religious morality, the monster will soon overpower him. Without religious guidance, science threatens the world with destruction. In contrast, science, when coupled with a religion like Buddhism, can transform this world into a haven of peace, security, and happiness. Never was there a time when the cooperation between science and religion is so desperately needed for the best interest and service of mankind. Religion without science is blind, while science without religion is crippled. Tribute to Buddhism. The wisdom of Buddhism, founded on compassion, has the vital role of correcting the dangerous direction modern science is heading for. Buddhism can provide the spiritual leadership to guide scientific research and invention in promoting a brilliant culture of the future. Buddhism can provide worthy goals for scientific advancement, which presently is facing a hopeless impasse of being enslaved by its very inventions. Albert Einstein paid a tribute to Buddhism when he said, "If there is any religion that would cope with modern scientific needs, it would be Buddhism." Buddhism requires no revision to keep it up to date with recent scientific findings. Buddhism need not surrender its views to science because it embraces science as well as goes beyond science. Buddhism bridges between religious and scientific thoughts by stimulating man to discover the latent potentialities within himself and his environment. Buddhism is timeless.